right, welcome to another episode of Pursuit. What better way to kick off the Advent Christmas festive season than to make our own Christmas sweaters? So throughout the episode, while we're discussing the topic for today, we're all going to be making our Christmas sweaters. If we finish, we finish. If not, you'll see it in the next one. All right? Asha, what are we talking about today?
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about new self. So we're going to be talking a lot about how basically, I'm going to try and say this without it being harsh, but like, but
be harsh. Just be harsh about it.
Listen, we're dead, okay? We are, unless Jesus works, transforms our heart. We're dead.
You know, I love the little fluttering hand when she said that.
We're dead. So yeah, we're gonna be talking about transformation and how we can get to that point. But yes.
We're talking about transformation while we're transforming our sweaters.
Changing lives.
Wait,
Strengthening families, impacting communities.
Wait, no, that did not work, but
That works.
oh, okay, cool. Because we're transforming.
I don't know, it clicked. I just wanted to bring that to your attention, just in case.
Okay, so have you guys felt like you were a different person at church versus in your personal life?
Yeah, I think definitely, especially when I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very, very different experience for me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, that was it. Sorry.
Anybody else feel like they kind of led a double life with being in church and personal?
Yes and no. Just because a lot of times when I was younger, I wouldn't, it's not that you're particularly doing anything, but you just don't bring that aspect of your life outside of where it is. So in that regard, yes. Because, like, there's sometimes, like, someone wouldn't necessarily know, like, oh, you're a Christian, just based off of, like, a random, regular conversation that you have.
Yeah, no, I definitely for a while lived like a double life kind of thing of Christian here, not Christian there. So that definitely happened for a while.
No one heard that.
I don't like that she said agree and then she like winked.
I saw that.
Right?
I was looking down.
Wink? She just raised her
And then I saw a
eyebrows.
wink, like,
Did you
It's-
see me wink?
It was.
I did not even
he was
wink.
like,
It was-
agreed. Or whatever
What?
you did.
No,
like,
that
So
is
does
not.
that mean that you're
You're looking at
currently?
Kevin? Wait, are you currently living a double life?
No.
Do tell.
I don't think,
That's
as someone that, I don't think you would expose yourself for living a double life if you currently were doing it.
I mean, but maybe she'll be transformed in this.
As a
podcast.
result.
Yeah, like you never know. We're
You
here
know?
for that.
Changing lives.
Strengthening this podcast. You know? I think for me, I can say. I thought I was loud enough, but here we go. I can say, yeah, I guess growing up in the church, you do kind of live a double life at some point until you. Until you like choose that you're really gonna follow Christ and like, you know, have that testimony. Cause I don't know like what episode we're on. But like have that testimony where you're gonna like, no, I don't want to live this life anymore, and you have to. I think that's gonna be an ongoing thing in our lifetime, because you do find yourself in certain situations where it's like, oh, that was not like living like Jesus. That wasn't like the best Christian I could have been. But I think that's okay once you can identify that and then move on.
Well, I think there's a difference between not being the best Christian in a particular situation and the double life of I'm not going to be Christian in this moment. Because that's really what I took the question to mean, right? So I think there's a big difference between, because I'm sure most of us, there's some way we could have improved how we handle the situation based on our faith and things like that. And it could just be something as long as we didn't know any better, right? I don't think that means we were living a double life. I think when you go and you're like, hey, you know what? No one from church is around. I can go and do whatever I want to do right now. And I'm not going to face any consequences or anything like that, which is, I think, kind of the standard mentality when we talk about that double life thing. And I think that's what we mean by double life.
Yeah, and that's a good clarification there, because if you
What?
We've hit a snag in our sweater decorating.
Sweater weather.
I was gonna say that then.
The glue ain't gluing like it's supposed to be gluing.
Okay.
That was.
Yeah. So there's a difference between genuinely not knowing that you're doing something wrong versus, I know that this is wrong, but I'm gonna continue to do it anyways because no one sees. But that kind of brings me to my next question is, what's your reaction to the fact that God knows everything about you, including the secrets that you keep?
I think we forget that a lot of times because a lot of times we're like, and I'm speaking very generally, like a lot of times you can be like, oh yeah, no one's gonna know I'm doing this, so it doesn't really matter because no one physically will know that you're doing it. But when you remember, like, God is omnipotent, he's like all present, all knowing, all like everything. So it's like, yeah, no one that can hold you physically accountable is knowing in this moment, but what's done in the darkness will come to light, right?
I agree. I think it's one of those things where, like, growing up you hear it, at least for me, like, because I grew up in church, like, growing up you hear it and you're like, yeah, but when you finally are like, oh no, like, they're gonna know. How would they know? Like, he knows. And when you finally, like, grasp that, I think it's for me, it was very jarring when I finally realized, like, no, God knows what I'm doing right here, right now.
But I think what makes it jarring, as you're saying, is not the fact, it's, do you care that he knows, right? Because I think a lot of people kind of understand, oh, well, God's watching, right? But that doesn't necessarily stop you from doing something, right? And I think it's really a matter of, well, where is God in your list of priorities in your life, right? I think that's what's the thing that will kind of stop me, like, oh, you know what? No one may ever know that I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, but God will, right? And that, like, I often think of the story of Joseph, right? Where when Potiphar's wife is trying to, like, seduce him or whatever, right? He goes, how can I sin against Potiphar, but how can I sin against God, right? His mindset was always, oh no, God is here. God is watching. So if I do something, right, I'm doing it understanding that God's going to see what I'm doing.
Right.
Yeah, it's almost because if you think about having the wanting to like hide certain things that you're doing that are wrong from people in the church, right? Yeah, you kind of like, God is more important, right? Your relationship with God is more important than, the people that you surround yourself with. Whereas, and I don't think that necessarily comes through all the time, and it doesn't it isn't known because you're just like, oh, like just because the people are, yeah, just because the people around me know, like, you're just like in this sphere where you're like, these people, they can see what I'm doing in plain sight, whereas, like, you can't see God, so it makes it like feel like, oh, he's not there. but like he does know everything, and you know that relationship is important. So
Well, go ahead, 'cause I know you want to say something.
Yeah, one thing that I know that I can't see in plain sight right now is the fact that Kevin is not decorating his sweater.
I'm not
getting to that.
So I would like to see that in plain sight.
I'm not gonna lie to you.
Thank you.
I've done this and I didn't even glue it.
I kind of want to chime in though, because I know what we're talking about here, like living this double life and God sees it all. And, you know, in that conviction, sometimes that's enough for you not to live that double life. But sometimes I want to like flip it now and say, we're living this life. God sees it all, but he still loves us. Right. And I want to like kind of shed light on that, where it's like, when you do get that conviction, it's kind of sometimes easier to go to him now, because he knows everything, and he knows the things that we don't even remember of ourselves. And I kind of like sometimes he is, I don't know how to say it, but like, wow, that's like dad, right? So like that's our father, and he just knows, and he knows, and like you can't even say it, but he knows. And I kind of wanted to shine light on that, where it's like you could be really bad in a dark place and conviction, and you're like, how do I go back to him? And he's right there because he knew. So we don't even have to say it sometimes.
So then why do you think God pursues us even though we openly disobey him a lot?
I think it's because he loves us that much, right? So he knows what is best for us, and because he has given us free will, he's just kind of he's waiting for us to realize that like I'm here. I'm here for you, right? Regardless of whatever it is you think you're worth or whatever you're going through, like just so you know, like you're better than anything else that you think in your brain, right? Like you can be capable of so many things if you just surrender your cares onto me.
I also think that when it comes to God pursuing us, I think if he was to not pursue us when we were doing the wrong thing, or we were being disobedient to him, I think to some degree it would be easy for us to do the inverse of what Chrissy was saying, as far as, well, look, God's not here. He doesn't love me, right? And I think he knows that and understands that better than us, right? So he understands, okay, I don't approve of what you're doing. I don't like what you're doing. I don't like the path you're going down. However, I still need you to know that I love you, right? Because I need you to know that there is, no matter how hopeless you may think the situation is, there is still hope, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why God knows that he has to pursue us, right? Because if he doesn't, then what hope is there? If God has abandoned us, what hope is there?
Right. Yeah, no.
Yeah, I'll be fine. I'll be better if I saw that you were also working on your sweater.
threw a googly eye at you.
Because we're watching you.
Okay.
oversee you. That's from God.
That was the
Not a plug.
Oh, that is really cute.
Copyright.
Are you kidding me?
That's not ugly.
Stick to my sweater like that. I lost another one.
That's not ugly.
We will give you a update on our sweaters.
Periodically.
Yeah. In
gonna be
case
that one
you
time
wanted
this
to
week.
know. If you don't care, move on. No, but that was a good point that you made. God pursues us. If he didn't, I don't even know. We would feel pretty, because I think this world can make us question our worth sometimes. So I feel like to know that, we have someone that sees every part of us, the good, the bad, and he still is here and he's like, I want a relationship with you. Stay with me. I think that that's, really special. So I know earlier we talked about, you know, the way that God, like that He's, you know, all knowing, all present, right? How do you? So that my next question is, how do you view Jesus, and would you say that you're casual about who He is, or do you recognize His significance?
I think that changes. I think that once again, I feel like that's been my answer a lot today, but I feel like that changes because I feel like when you're growing up, like, yeah, like you know how great God is
Mm-hmm.
and how great Jesus is and everything he did for you. But then I feel like as you experience him and as you go through things in life, then you really start to see his significance and how great he is and how powerful he is. So I think it's something that changes.
I think so okay, so one of the things that I was actually talking with my brother, I think, about recently was this idea of actually like understanding like the glory of God, right? Because and again, I think a lot of the questions that you're kind of throwing out there to us, a lot of it really is, how do you view God, right? So again, is it a casual thing? Do you take God serious, right? And one of the things that we were talking about was my aunt recently passed away, and we were talking about this idea of like, well, how does God get glory in someone passing away, right? Because that's a really hard thing for people to understand. And in my head, right, I was wondering that, and I wasn't really wondering it for me as much as like, well, what do I tell her grandkids who are not Christian? Like, she was Christian, but her grandkids and even her kids aren't, right? And her grandkids are my age, right? So it's I think she had like 2 great grandkids. So, but, because I was thinking even of the story for like Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, right? And one of the reasons why, like, oh, well, Jesus, why didn't you come sooner? You could have healed him. Well, this had to happen so God will get glory, right? But in that case, Lazarus gets raised from the dead. There's this obvious way God gets glory.
Right.
And I think a lot of times, if God is not obvious to us, he's almost non-existent. And that's why it's easy to to live a double life, because when you come to church on Sunday, God is obvious. When you leave the church doors, God is no longer obvious, right? And I think a lot of it is, the better you know God, the more your relationship with him, or more your, I don't know what the right word is, your sense of his presence becomes more like obvious, right? And the more obvious he is to you, I feel the less likely you are to live that double life. You, as Chrissy was talking about in the beginning, you may not be the best Christian, right? And you may be trying to get better, but I think you won't be just blatantly disobeying him anymore. The more obvious he is.
Yeah, I think it's easier to, as you said, if you're not openly pursuing a relationship with God, if you don't really know him, when you enter church on Sunday or whatever you do during the week and you leave, he's not so obvious to you. And that does take a lot of faith. It takes a lot of obedience for you to go out there and say, like, even this is my church out here too, like I'm yeah, oh. I'm a representation of God out here too, So with God, with you having to be obedient, I think, constantly there is going to be a struggle between flesh and spirit when you're out there on your own, and you're not actively working on your relationship with God. I do have a passage to read. It's it's Mark 2:17, and it says, Jesus, overhearing, shot back, "Who needs a doctor, the healthy or the sick? I'm here inviting the sin sick, not the spiritually fit." Um, what do you guys feel about that passage? Because I feel like there's a lot that could be said.
I think that it's one of those things that even when we're talking to other people about Christ, they'll be like, oh, like, come to church. And they'll be like, why? There's just a bunch of hypocrites at church. And it's like, okay. But that's essentially what a church is. A church is filled with people, and people are imperfect. And like that passage says, Jesus came for the sick. He's coming for those who need him. If you're not sick, you don't go to the doctor.
You should still.
You should. I mean, yeah, okay, yes. For legal purposes, please go to your checkups. Please check yourself. Go to the dentist. Go to the eye doctor. Do all those good things. But I mean, like, if you're not, outside of those conventions that we have now, because they weren't always conventions, like, a church is a place for people who are hurt. Because it's I want to be careful how I say it, because I don't want it to seem like, oh, I'm healed now, I don't need the church anymore. Like, but a church is a place, or it should be a place, for people who are hurting, for people who need healing, both physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Because even today, there are a lot of young people who have been hurt by the church, quote unquote, whatever that means to some people, but like, they have been hurt. And it's one of those things where we should be a place of refuge for those. And that's one of the many ways that we show Christ, is by showing our love.
I think, sorry, I want to, because, you always hear that the church should be like a hospital for the sick and things like that, right? And I personally don't like that saying, because it almost makes it sound as though there are people who are essentially not in need of a hospital then, right? And I think that when we talk about church and we talk about that thing specifically, right, Jesus was talking to these Jewish religious leaders, right, who thought very highly of themselves, so highly of themselves that they're talking to the Messiah they're looking for and don't know it, right? And I think that's when we talk about this idea of the church being a place for the sick, right? It's understand who was the flip side of that, right? Because there's a lot of people who can say, well, I don't have any issues, I don't need to come to church, right? And I think really what the Bible, or what Jesus is trying to get to, is, okay, everyone has a need for the church, right? Even if you may not be necessarily going through some dark season in life or whatever, right? The church is meant to be a community, right? When you understand that a church, we often say, when I think just because of I feel like it's a more fancy way to say this, but like the way in which language is structured, when we talk about church, we typically are talking about a physical building that we would attend, right? But understand that really the church is the congregation. It's the actual people, right? So Jesus is saying this community should be a place of healing, not a place of people who just look down on others because they need to be healed, right? And I think when we all begin to sort of adopt that mindset, we see that our church experience changes, because now we're adopting really Christ mindset towards other people. Whether they're a believer or an unbeliever, they need this community. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Bible verse was really it was powerful because it just shows what kind of God we have. He's not saying, you know, you have to be up to a certain standard to be in this church or to be with the people. He said, I'm calling the sin sick, not the spiritually fit. So why do you, because I feel like God has made it pretty clear of, like, he's shown us his love many of times, but why do you think it's so difficult for us to see God's love?
I think a lot of times it's difficult to see God's love because you need to be constantly like looking for what that looks like in your life, right? So a lot of times we might not notice it because we're not looking for it, but like hindsight's 2020, right? So you'll look back and say like, wow, God really had like he really had me back then when I didn't think he did. So it has to be something that you're actively looking for and seeking out to know like the signs of it around you.
It goes back to, it's often not obvious, right? Like, as you know, we've heard or we will hear about Rain, we talking about some of her friends and stuff like that. So I don't really know when this episode is even going to drop at this point. But, you know, one thing she talked about is like she was praying about friends and all of a sudden people stopped talking to her. And it's like, well, wait, why is it happening? You realize, no, this is God answering my prayer. This is God showing me love by he's cutting people out of my life that should not be there, right? But we don't attribute that to love. It's not obvious until we look back and be like, oh no, that was God protecting me because he loves me. So I think a lot of times it's, again, we sometimes have to kind of stop and maybe even talk to God and be like, hey God, what's happening here? Is this you? Right? And I think for a lot of us, for some reason, I think a lot of people have a fear of asking God, is this you? Right? Which we shouldn't, right? 'Cause I think there's it's almost like some people believe it's a taboo to question God when, no, if you need to know if it's God, ask him, right? God, is this you? And he'll tell you, because I don't believe that God wants to hide himself from you, right? If we're saying God is pursuing you, why would he then not tell you if this is him or something else?
Yeah, and I feel like we have a lot of resources that we can turn to in order to see God speak in our life. And yeah, we should definitely take advantage of, you know, being able to ask God of like anything that we're unsure of. How have you seen God change you since you decided to follow him?
So I think it's so like most of us, we've grown up within the church, right? But I think once you make that active decision to follow him like wholeheartedly versus just like, oh, I'm here, this is what I've grown up with, this is what I've known, you kind of see your behavior shift in certain ways. So like in one of the episodes, we'll be talking about friendships, right? And we talked about how as you get older, you learn how to discern between the types of friends you should have and how you should build those relationships. And I think that also comes with when you build your relationship with God and you seek him out and build that foundation upon him, you kind of see how not only the relationships you seek change, but also the behaviors that you yourself maintain shift.
Yeah.
I think it definitely changes and the behaviors change. I think for me, the biggest thing that changed was my level of patience. And it's definitely still a work in progress, but that's definitely one of the big things for me is the level of patience that I have has definitely gone up, especially after having kids. it's a lot. So patience has been my biggest change since I decided to really follow Christ.
So I think with what we're been talking about, it's important for us to acknowledge the fact that God pursues us, not only pursues us, but wants to transform us, make us essentially to look more and more like Christ each and every day. And that then trickles down to every aspect of our life, right? Whether it's school, it's work, our friendships, family relationships, the people you're dating or who you're married to, like your kid, like it trickles down into all those aspects of life. And I think when it comes to, especially for, I think more so young people than older people, of avoiding that double life, it's when you have a relationship with God, are you able to really acknowledge the fact that he's there all the time, right? And I think when you begin to acknowledge the fact he's there, you will see your life start to transform, because once you acknowledge him, that's the process that's just going to happen.